The heavy oak doors of the courthouse swung open with a bang that echoed through the marble halls. Richard Lopez strutted through those doors like he owned the building, his expensive Italian shoes clicking against the polished floor with each confident step. His arm was wrapped around a woman who wasn't his wife, a young blonde named Vanessa who clung to his side like a designer accessory. She wore a tight red dress that screamed for attention, her perfectly manicured nails digging into Richard's $1,000 suit jacket. But it wasn't just their entrance that made everyone in the courthouse corridor stop and stare. It was the look on Richard's face, a smile so smug and self-satisfied that it made even the security guards uncomfortable. This was a man who thought he held all the cards, who believed he was about to destroy someone completely and walk away richer for it. "This is going to be easier than I thought," Richard whispered to Vanessa as they approached courtroom B. His voice carried that particular tone of a man who had never been told no, never been denied anything he wanted. "By the time I'm done with her, Aliyah won't have a penny to her name." Vanessa giggled, a sound that was meant to be charming but came out sharp and grating. "And then we can finally be together properly. No more hiding, no more sneaking around." She pressed herself closer to him, making sure anyone watching could see exactly what kind of relationship they had. What Richard didn't notice as he basked in his own confidence was the woman sitting quietly on the wooden bench outside the courtroom. Aliyah Lopez, his wife of 8 years, the mother of his twin children, the woman he was about to try and destroy, sat with her hands folded in her lap, watching his grand entrance with eyes that held secrets he couldn't imagine. Aliyah was beautiful in a way that didn't need announcing. Her dark skin glowed under the courthouse's fluorescent lights, and her natural hair was pulled back in a simple but elegant style. She wore a navy blue dress that was professional without being showy, the kind of outfit that said she was serious about business. But there was something else in her posture, something in the slight curve of her lips that suggested she knew something Richard didn't. "Mrs. Lopez?" Her lawyer, Patricia Williams, appeared beside her, carrying a thick folder that seemed to weigh more than it should. "Are you ready for this?" Aliyah stood slowly, smoothing down her dress. "I've been ready for this day for months, Patricia. The question is whether Richard is ready for what's coming." Inside the courtroom, Judge Harrison was already taking his seat behind the bench. He was an older man with gray hair and tired eyes that had seen too many ugly divorces, too many families torn apart by greed and betrayal. But today something was different. Today he had papers in front of him that would change everything. Richard swaggered into the courtroom like he was walking into a boardroom where he was about to close the deal of a lifetime. His team of expensive lawyers followed behind him, their briefcases full of documents and strategies designed to paint Aliyah as an unfaithful wife who deserved nothing. Vanessa took a seat in the gallery, making sure she was visible to everyone, especially Aliyah. "Your Honor," Richard's lead attorney began as soon as the proceedings started, "my client is here today because he has discovered disturbing truths about his marriage. We have reason to believe that Mrs. Lopez has been unfaithful to her marriage vows, and furthermore, we question the paternity of the children she claims are my client's." The words hung in the air like poison. Richard sat back in his chair, that same smug smile spreading across his face as he watched for Aliyah's reaction. He expected tears, maybe anger, certainly panic. Instead, he saw nothing but calm determination. "Mr. Lopez," Judge Harrison said, his voice cutting through the tension, "you're claiming that the twin children you've been raising for 5 years are not biologically yours?" "That's correct, Your Honor," Richard replied, his voice steady and confident. "I believe my wife has been deceiving me about their parentage, and I refuse to continue supporting children who may not be mine." Vanessa shifted in her seat, barely containing her excitement. This was going exactly as they had planned. Richard would get out of paying child support, Aliyah would be left with nothing, and they could start their new life together with his billions intact. But Judge Harrison was looking at something on his desk, something that made his expression change completely. He picked up a manila envelope, the kind that held important documents, and held it for a moment before speaking. "Mr. Lopez, before we proceed any further with your claims about paternity, I think you should know that this court has already received some very interesting information." The confidence began to drain from Richard's face. This wasn't in the script he had written for this day. "What kind of information, Your Honor?" his lawyer asked, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. Judge Harrison opened the envelope slowly, deliberately. "DNA test results, for starters. Comprehensive financial records. Sworn testimony from multiple witnesses." He looked directly at Richard. "The kind of evidence that tends to make certain claims problematic." Richard's face went white. Beside him, his lawyers were shuffling through their papers frantically, trying to understand what was happening. In the gallery, Vanessa's smile was fading fast. Alaya remained perfectly still, her hands folded, watching her husband's world begin to crack at the edges. She had known this moment would come. She had planned for it, prepared for it, waited for it. Now it was here, and Richard was about to learn that the woman he thought he could destroy had been several moves ahead of him all along. "Perhaps, Mr. Lopez," Judge Harrison continued, "you'd like to reconsider some of your claims before we proceed?" But Richard was too stunned to speak. The man who had walked into this courtroom like a conquering king was suddenly looking around the room as if he couldn't understand how he had gotten there. The smile was completely gone now, replaced by something that looked very much like fear. Because sometimes, the person you think you're about to destroy is actually the one holding all the cards. And sometimes, justice comes wearing a navy blue dress and a knowing smile. 8 years earlier, Richard Lopez had been a different man entirely. He was still ambitious, still brilliant with technology, still driven to succeed, but there had been something softer about him then, something that made people want to trust him. That was the man Alaya had fallen in love with at the campus coffee shop where she worked to pay her way through law school. Alaya remembered that first meeting like it was yesterday. She had been pulling a double shift, trying to save money for her textbooks, when this tall, confident man walked up to her counter. He wasn't flashy then, just jeans and a simple button-down shirt, his dark hair slightly messy from running his hands through it. But there was something about his eyes, the way they lit up when he talked about his ideas for changing the world through technology. "I'll have a large coffee, black," he had said, then paused. "Actually, make it 2. You look like you could use one." Most customers barely looked at her, treating her like part of the coffee machine. But Richard really saw her. When she told him she was studying law, he didn't make jokes about lawyers or ask if she was planning to sue anyone. Instead, he asked what kind of law she wanted to practice, what cases mattered to her, what changes she hoped to make in the world. They talked for 20 minutes after her shift ended. Then 40 minutes the next day. By the end of the week, Richard was timing his visits to coincide with her breaks, and Alaya found herself looking forward to seeing him walk through that door. "I'm working on something big," he told her one evening as they walked across campus together. "A platform that could revolutionize how people connect with technology. But I don't want to be one of those tech guys who get so caught up in the code that they forget about the human element." That was what she loved about him then. He cared about people, not just profits. When he talked about his company, it wasn't about getting rich. It was about making life better, easier, more connected for everyone. Their first real date was at a small Italian restaurant off campus. Richard showed up with flowers, not expensive roses, but a simple bouquet of sunflowers because he remembered her mentioning they were her favorite. He was nervous, which surprised her. This confident man who talked about changing the world was fidgeting with his napkin because he wanted to impress a law student who made coffee for a living. "I have to tell you something," he said over dinner. "I think you're the most incredible woman I've ever met. Smart, kind, beautiful, and you're not impressed by my big dreams and startup talk, which makes me want to impress you even more." Alaya had laughed, feeling her heart skip in a way she'd never experienced before. "Your big dreams don't impress me," she said. "But the fact that you remember how I take my coffee and that you ask about my constitutional law class, and that you tip the servers really well even when you're clearly counting every dollar, that impresses me." 6 months later, Richard's platform launched and everything changed overnight. The company he'd been building in his tiny apartment suddenly had investors knocking down his door. The simple guy who bought coffee became the CEO of a tech startup worth millions, then tens of millions, then hundreds of millions. But success didn't change him right away. Even as the money poured in, even as his company grew bigger and more powerful, Richard stayed grounded. He insisted on paying for Alaya's law school tuition, not as a loan but as a gift. "Partners support each other," he said. "And we're partners in this, aren't we?" Their wedding was small but perfect. Richard could have afforded something massive and showy by then, but they chose a simple ceremony in the garden behind the coffee shop where they'd met. Alaya wore her grandmother's dress, altered to fit her perfectly. Richard cried when he saw her walking down the aisle, and his vows were about building a life together, not building an empire. "I promise to love you whether we're broke college students or successful professionals," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "I promise to remember that the most important thing I'll ever have is not my company or my money, but you." For the first 3 years of their marriage he kept that promise. Even as his wealth grew beyond anything either of them had imagined, Richard remained the man who noticed when Alaya had a hard day at her law firm, who brought her soup when she was sick, who insisted they take real vacations where they turned off their phones and just enjoyed being together. When Alaya got pregnant with the twins, Richard was over the moon. He read every parenting book he could find, went to every doctor's appointment, and spent hours talking to her belly about all the things he wanted to teach his children. "They're going to be so lucky to have you as their mother," he whispered one night, his hand on her growing stomach. The twins Olivia and Nathan were born on a snowy December morning, and Richard held each of them like they were made of glass. "They're perfect," he kept saying, tears streaming down his face. "Look at them, Aliyah. We made these perfect little people." Those early years of parenthood were challenging but beautiful. Richard was hands-on in a way that surprised everyone who knew him as a ruthless businessman. He changed diapers, did midnight feedings, and insisted on reading bedtime stories even when he had important calls to take. "The business can wait," he would say. "My children can't." But somewhere around the twins' third birthday, something began to shift. Richard's company had gone public by then, making him a billionaire on paper. The pressure was enormous: shareholders to please, competitors to outmaneuver, deals to close that were worth more money than most people could comprehend. He started working longer hours, traveling more frequently, coming home exhausted and distracted. "You're missing dinner again," Aliyah would say gently, trying not to sound like she was nagging. "I know, baby, I'm sorry. This deal is just so important. Once it closes, things will calm down." But things never calmed down. There was always another deal, another crisis, another opportunity too big to pass up. The man who had once timed his coffee shop visits to coincide with her breaks was now scheduling phone calls during their anniversary dinner. Aliyah tried to be understanding. She knew the pressure he was under, knew how much responsibility he carried. She took on more of the parenting duties, managed their household, and supported his career even when it meant sacrificing time together. She told herself it was temporary, that the loving husband and father she'd married was still there, just buried under the weight of his success. She didn't know that success was also burying him under the attention of other women. Women who saw his wealth and power and wanted to be part of it. Women who didn't care that he was married, who saw his wedding ring as a challenge rather than a boundary. Looking back now, Aliyah could see the signs she'd missed. The way Richard started paying more attention to his appearance, buying expensive clothes and working out more. The way he became secretive about his phone, taking calls in other rooms and sleeping with it face down on his nightstand. The way he stopped talking about their future together and started talking about his business as if it were his only priority. But she had trusted him. Even when doubt crept in, even when her instincts told her something was wrong, she chose to believe in the man she had married. She chose to believe that their love was stronger than whatever was pulling him away. That trust, she now realized, had been her biggest mistake. Because while she was choosing to believe in their marriage, Richard was choosing to betray it. The first sign something was wrong came on a Tuesday evening in March. Aliyah had been folding laundry in their bedroom when Richard's phone, which he'd left charging on his nightstand, buzzed with a text message. The screen lit up, and without meaning to, she saw the preview. "Missing you already, baby. Can't wait for our itty baby. Can't wait for our weekend in Miami." Aliyah's hands stopped moving. She stared at the phone, telling herself there had to be an innocent explanation. Maybe it was a business associate with poor boundaries. Maybe it was spam. Maybe her eyes were playing tricks on her in the dim bedroom light. But her heart knew the truth even as her mind scrambled for alternatives. Richard had never mentioned a weekend trip to Miami. He'd told her he was going to Seattle for a conference. When Richard came upstairs an hour later, Aliyah was sitting on their bed, his phone in her hands. She had wrestled with herself about whether to look, whether to violate his privacy based on one suspicious text. But in the end, the need to know had been stronger than her respect for boundaries. "Aliyah? What are you doing with my phone?" Her husband stood in the doorway, his expression shifting from confusion to something that looked very much like panic. He was still handsome, success had been good to him physically, keeping him fit and well-dressed. But in that moment, looking at his face, Aliyah saw a stranger. "Who is Vanessa?" she asked quietly. Richard's face went white. For a long moment, he didn't say anything, just stood there like a man trying to figure out which lie would work best. Finally, he walked into the room and sat down heavily in the chair by their window. She works for me. My new assistant." "Your assistant signs her text to you with heart emojis?" Aliyah had scrolled through enough of their conversation to see the pattern. Months of messages, increasingly intimate, increasingly graphic. Plans for secret meetings, declarations of love, discussions about their future together. And running through it all, Vanessa's constant complaints about Richard's wife, the woman who was holding him back, and keeping him from being happy. "Aliyah, I can explain. Can you?" She stood up, surprised by how calm her voice sounded. Inside, she felt like she was breaking apart, but somehow she managed to keep her composure. Can you explain why your assistant is telling you she loves you? Can you explain why she's talking about leaving your wife? Can you explain the hotel receipts I found in your jacket pocket? Richard's shoulders sagged. The fight went out of him all at once, as if he was relieved to finally stop pretending. How long have you known? I've suspected for months. But I didn't want to believe it. Aliyah sat back down on the bed, suddenly feeling exhausted. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, that success was just changing you, that you were under stress. I made excuses for every late night, every business trip, every time you seemed distant. Aliyah, please. Let me explain what happened. What happened is that you decided our marriage wasn't enough for you anymore. Her voice was still calm, but tears had started rolling down her cheeks. What happened is that you met a young, beautiful woman who was impressed by your money and your power, and you decided she was worth throwing away 8 years of marriage. Richard tried to reach for her hand, but she pulled away. It's not like that. Vanessa and it just happened. I didn't plan it. Nothing just happens, Richard. You made choices. You chose to hire a woman you were attracted to. You chose to spend time alone with her. You chose to start texting her outside of work. You chose to take her on business trips. You chose to sleep with her. Each word hit him like a physical blow. And you chose to lie to me about all of it. I was going to tell you. When? When were you going to tell me? After your weekend in Miami? After you decided whether she was worth leaving me for? Richard had no answer for that. He sat in his chair, this powerful man who commanded boardrooms and made million-dollar decisions without hesitation, and he had nothing to say to his wife. Aliyah wiped her eyes and stood up again. I'm sleeping in the guest room tonight. Tomorrow we need to talk about what happens next. Aliyah, wait. Please. I know I messed up, but we can fix this. I can end things with Vanessa. We can go to counseling. I love you. No. The word came out sharper than she intended. You don't get to say you love me. Not anymore. Love doesn't cheat. Love doesn't lie. Love doesn't make plans with someone else while pretending everything is fine at home. She walked toward the door, then turned back to look at him one more time. The man sitting in that chair bore little resemblance to the person she'd married. Success hadn't just changed him, it had revealed who he really was underneath. Or maybe it had turned him into someone else entirely. Either way, he wasn't the man she'd fallen in love with. The children can't know about this yet, she said. Whatever we decide to do, we protect them from this mess until we figure out how to handle it. Richard nodded, looking defeated. Of course. Whatever you want. But as Aliyah lay awake in the guest room that night, staring at the ceiling, she realized that what she wanted was impossible. She wanted to go back in time. She wanted to unknow what she now knew. She wanted her husband to be the man who had bought her sunflowers and promised to love her whether they were broke or successful. Instead, she was married to a man who had chosen his assistant over his family, who had been living a double life for months, who had looked her in the eye every day while planning a future that didn't include her. Over the next few days, Aliyah did what she always did when faced with a problem. She researched. She hired a private investigator, not because she didn't believe what she'd seen on Richard's phone, but because she needed to know the full extent of his betrayal. She needed to know how long it had been going on, how serious it was, and what Richard's real intentions were. What she learned broke her heart all over again. The affair had been going on for 2 years, not months. Vanessa wasn't just Richard's assistant. She was a calculated woman who had set her sights on a wealthy married man and systematically seduced him. And Richard had been more than willing to be seduced. But the worst part wasn't the cheating itself. It was the conversations between Richard and Vanessa about Aliyah and the children. The way they talked about her like she was an obstacle to be overcome, a problem to be solved. The way Richard complained about his family responsibilities, about how much easier life would be without a wife who expected him to come home for dinner and children who needed bedtime stories. She's getting suspicious, Richard had texted Vanessa just weeks before Aliyah discovered the truth. I think I need to start planning my exit strategy. Good, Vanessa had replied. I'm tired of sharing you. When can you leave her? I need to be careful. She could take half of everything in a divorce. Not if you're smart about it. There are ways to protect your assets. Reading those messages, Aliyah realized that Richard hadn't just betrayed their marriage, he had been actively planning to destroy her financially while pretending to love her. He had been calculating how to leave her with as little as possible while he started a new life with a woman who saw him as a meal ticket. That was when Aliyah stopped crying and started planning. Because if Richard thought he could discard her like an outdated piece of technology, he was about to learn that he had seriously underestimated the woman he had married. Aliyah had always been methodical. It was what made her a good lawyer and what had helped her build a stable life even when Richard's schedule became increasingly chaotic. Now, sitting in her home office at 2 in the morning, she applied that same methodical approach to something she had never imagined she would need to do, planning the destruction of her husband's attempt to destroy her. The private investigator she had hired, Janet Rodriguez, was a former police detective who specialized in matrimonial cases. She was a small, unassuming woman who could blend into any crowd, but her reputation for uncovering the truth was formidable. When she laid out her findings about Richard's affair in Aliyah's living room, the evidence was overwhelming. "Mrs. Lopez, I've been doing this for 15 years, and I have to tell you, your husband and his girlfriend have been sloppy. They think they're being careful, but they've left a trail of evidence that a first-year law student could follow." Janet spread photographs across the coffee table. Richard and Vanessa entering hotels together. Richard and Vanessa having intimate dinners at expensive restaurants. Richard and Vanessa shopping for jewelry together, jewelry that Aliyah had never seen. "This bracelet," Janet pointed to a photo of Vanessa wearing an elaborate diamond piece, "was purchased with your husband's credit card 3 months ago. Cost $35,000. The same week he told you the family needed to cut back on expenses." Aliyah studied the photos with the same attention she gave to legal documents. Each image told a story of betrayal, but more than that, they told a story of calculation. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment or a midlife crisis. This was a deliberate, systematic deception that had been going on for years. "There's more," Janet continued, pulling out a thick folder. "Financial records. Your husband has been moving money around, setting up accounts that you're not aware of. He's been preparing for a divorce, but not the kind where assets get split fairly. This was what hurt the most, not just that Richard was cheating, but that he had been planning to cheat her out of what was rightfully hers. While she had been working to hold their family together, he had been working to ensure she would have nothing when he left." "Show me everything," Aliyah said. Over the next several hours, Janet walked her through Richard's financial maneuvers. Offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Shell companies designed to hide assets. Business deals structured to minimize his apparent net worth. He had been moving millions of dollars beyond the reach of any potential divorce settlement. "The good news," Janet said, "is that he's not as smart as he thinks he is. These transactions leave digital footprints. We can trace every dollar he's tried to hide. And the bad news? He's planning to accelerate his timeline. My sources tell me he's been meeting with divorce attorneys. High-powered ones who specialize in protecting wealthy men's assets." Aliyah felt a chill run down her spine. "How long do I have?" "Based on what I'm seeing, I guess he'll file within the next few months. He's just waiting for the right moment. Probably when he thinks you're least prepared to fight back." That night, after Janet left, Aliyah sat in her kitchen drinking tea and thinking. Richard was upstairs, probably texting Vanessa about their next secret rendezvous. Her children were sleeping peacefully in their beds, unaware that their world was about to explode. And she was sitting alone, trying to figure out how to protect her family from the man who was supposed to be protecting them. The old Aliyah might have confronted Richard immediately. She might have demanded explanations, begged him to reconsider, fought for their marriage with everything she had. But the old Aliyah had trusted her husband to be honest with her. The new Aliyah, the one who had seen the evidence of his betrayal and his plans to destroy her, was smarter than that. If Richard wanted to play games, she would play games. But she would play them better than he ever could. The next morning, Aliyah called her own lawyer, not the family attorney who had handled their wills and property purchases, but Patricia Williams, a divorce specialist with a reputation for protecting women from wealthy men who tried to hide their assets. Patricia had been a year ahead of Aliyah in law school, and they had maintained a friendship over the years. "I was wondering when you were going to call me," Patricia said when Aliyah explained the situation. "I've been hearing rumors about Richard in certain circles. The kind of rumors that usually mean a divorce is coming." "What kind of rumors?" "The kind where wealthy men start asking other wealthy men for recommendations about divorce attorneys. Your husband's name has come up in several conversations I've had with colleagues." So Richard was further along in his planning than even Janet had suspected. The knowledge should have devastated Aliyah, but instead it strengthened her resolve. She was done being the unsuspecting wife. From now on she would be the one who was 3 steps ahead. "I need to know everything," Aliyah told Patricia. "Every asset, every account, every business interest. And I need to know it before he files. That's going to require some aggressive investigation. It won't be cheap. I don't care about the cost. I care about protecting my children and making sure Richard doesn't get away with stealing what belongs to our family. Over the next few weeks, Aliyah became someone she had never imagined she could be: sneaky, calculating, and utterly focused on gathering intelligence. She copied financial documents when Richard wasn't looking. She installed software on his computer that would track his activities. She even started recording their conversations when he would come home late with obviously false explanations about where he had been. The hardest part was pretending everything was normal. She had to smile at Richard over breakfast, ask about his day when he came home, and act like a loving wife while knowing he was planning to betray her in the worst possible way. There were nights when she lay awake next to him, listening to him sleep, wondering how someone could share a bed with a person they were planning to destroy. But the acting got easier as the evidence piled up. Phone records showing hundreds of calls to Vanessa. Credit card statements revealing expensive gifts and hotel stays. Bank records showing money being systematically moved to accounts Aliyah couldn't access. Each piece of evidence made her more determined to make sure Richard's plan backfired spectacularly. 3 months into her investigation, Aliyah made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden in Richard's home office, in a file she was sure he thought she would never find, were documents outlining his complete strategy for the divorce. Not just the financial aspects, but a comprehensive plan to paint her as an unfit mother and unfaithful wife. According to Richard's notes, he planned to claim that Aliyah had been having an affair, a complete fabrication designed to give him grounds for divorce and potentially affect custody arrangements. Even worse, he planned to demand paternity tests for their twins, claiming he had reason to believe they might not be his children. Reading those documents, Aliyah felt something inside her break completely. This wasn't just about money or even infidelity anymore. Richard was planning to question the parentage of their children, children he had held in his arms the day they were born, children he had read bedtime stories to, children who called him daddy and ran to him when he came home from work. That was when Aliyah decided that simply protecting herself wasn't enough. Richard wanted to play dirty? She would show him what dirty really looked like. The next day she called Janet Rodriguez with new instructions. I want you to get me DNA tests for the twins. Not because I have any doubt about who their father is, but because I want to be prepared when Richard makes his accusations. Are you sure about this, Mrs. Lopez? Once we have those results, I'm absolutely sure. And while you're at it, I want you to dig deeper into Vanessa's background. If she's helping Richard plan this betrayal, I want to know everything about her. As it turned out, Vanessa had her own secrets. Secrets that would prove very useful when the time came to destroy Richard's perfect plan. The revelation about Vanessa came on a Thursday afternoon when Janet Rodriguez called with information that made Aliyah's blood run cold. She was sitting in her car outside Olivia and Nathan's school, waiting for dismissal, when her phone rang. Mrs. Lopez, you need to hear this. I've been digging into Vanessa's background like you asked, and what I found is going to blow your mind. Aliyah adjusted her Bluetooth and leaned back in her seat. Tell me. Your husband's girlfriend isn't just some innocent assistant who got swept up in an affair. This woman is a professional. She's done this before, targeted wealthy married men, seduced them, and walked away with substantial financial settlements. What do you mean? I mean, this is her third married billionaire. The first one was in California tech executive, divorced his wife after a 2-year affair with Vanessa, gave her a settlement of $5 million to go away quietly. The second was a New York real estate mogul, same pattern. She walked away with $7 million and a penthouse apartment. Aliyah felt sick. So Richard isn't her first mark. Not even close. And here's the really interesting part, she's not even 25 yet. This woman has been running this con since she was barely legal. She's got a system, Mrs. Lopez. She researches her targets, gets jobs in their companies, and then systematically destroys their marriages while positioning herself to cash out big. Does Richard know? Based on what I've seen, I don't think so. She's very good at playing the innocent victim. Makes herself seem vulnerable, makes these men feel like they're her saviors. Classic manipulation. Aliyah watched other parents gathering outside the school, waiting for their children, living their normal lives without knowing that their worlds could be turned upside down by someone like Vanessa. What else did you find? Financial records showing she's been pressing Richard to divorce you as quickly as possible. Text messages where she's coaching him on what to say to his lawyers. And here's the kicker, she's already been apartment hunting in Manhattan. Penthouses that cost more than most people make in a lifetime. The school bell rang and children began streaming out of the building. Aliyah spotted her twins immediately, Olivia with her backpack dragging behind her, Nathan running ahead as usual. They looked so innocent, so unaware that their father was planning to question whether they were even his children. "There's more," Janet continued. "I found communications between Vanessa and a lawyer in New York. Not a divorce lawyer, but someone who specializes in what they call relationship consulting. Basically, they coach women on how to maximize their payouts from affairs with wealthy men. So this whole thing was planned from the beginning. From the moment she applied to work at Richard's company. She researched him, learned about his marriage, his children, his business pressures. She knew exactly which buttons to push." Aliyah got out of her car and walked toward her children, her mind racing. This changed everything. Richard wasn't just having an affair, he was being systematically manipulated by a woman who made a living destroying families. But that also meant he was going to be even more dangerous, because Vanessa would push him to be as ruthless as possible to maximize her payday. "Mom?" Nathan ran into her arms, his 5-year-old energy immediately lifting her spirits despite everything she had just learned. "Guess what happened at recess?" "Tell me everything," she said, hugging him tightly. Olivia joined them, always more reserved than her brother but equally affectionate. "Can we get ice cream?" Olivia asked hopefully. "Of course we can," Aliyah said, making a decision. If Richard was planning to destroy their family, she was going to make sure her children had as many happy memories as possible before their world changed forever. That evening, while the twins did homework at the kitchen table and Richard worked late again, or claimed to be working late, Aliyah sat in her home office reviewing the mountain of evidence she had accumulated. Bank statements showing Richard had moved over $50 million to accounts she had never heard of. Property records showing he had purchased a vacation home in Vanessa's name. Investment portfolios that had been restructured to minimize his apparent net worth. But the most damaging evidence was Richard's own words. Thanks to the software she had installed on his computer, Aliyah had access to his emails and text messages. What she found, there was a systematic plan to portray her as an unstable, unfaithful wife who was trying to trap him in a marriage he no longer wanted. "She's getting suspicious about the trips," Richard had written to Vanessa just days earlier. "I think she knows something." "Then we need to move faster," Vanessa had replied. "The longer we wait, the more time she has to prepare. You need to file for divorce before she gets her own lawyer." "What if she fights me on custody?" "That's what the paternity thing is for, baby. If you can make people doubt those kids are yours, it changes everything. Plus, I've been thinking, we need to be prepared to show she's been cheating too." "But she hasn't been cheating." "Doesn't matter. We just need to create reasonable doubt. I know people who can help with that." Reading those messages, Aliyah felt a rage so pure it was almost cleansing. These people weren't just planning to destroy her marriage, they were planning to destroy her relationship with her children, her reputation, her entire life. And they were discussing it like it was a business transaction. Well, if they wanted to treat this like business, Aliyah would show them what a hostile takeover really looked like. The next morning, she called Patricia Williams with new instructions. "I want to file first, before Richard has a chance to implement his plan. Are you sure you're ready for that? Once we file, there's no going back." "I'm not just ready, I'm eager. And I want to include everything. The hidden assets, the affair, the financial fraud. I want to go after him for everything he's tried to steal from our family. That's going to be a very aggressive approach. Richard will fight back hard. Let him fight. I have evidence he doesn't even know I have. And I have something else he's not expecting." "What's that?" Aliyah looked at the DNA test results that had arrived that morning, confirming what she had never doubted, that Olivia and Nathan were absolutely, unquestionably Richard's biological children. "I have the truth." Over the next few weeks, Aliyah and Patricia worked around the clock to prepare their case. They documented every hidden asset, every suspicious transaction, every lie Richard had told. They prepared testimony from witnesses who had seen Richard and Vanessa together. They compiled evidence of Vanessa's history of targeting wealthy married men. But most importantly, they prepared for Richard's inevitable counterattack. Because if there was one thing Aliyah had learned about her husband, it was that he didn't like to lose. And when backed into a corner, he would do anything to win. "He's going to come at you hard," Patricia warned as they finalized their filing. "He'll try to paint you as vindictive, greedy, unstable. He'll question your fitness as a mother. He'll try to make you look like the villain in this story." "Let him try," Aliyah said, signing the divorce papers with a steady hand. "I've got 8 years of being the perfect wife, 2 beautiful children who adore me, and a mountain of evidence showing exactly who the real villain is." The papers were filed on a Monday morning. By noon, Richard's phone was ringing with calls from his lawyers, telling him that his wife had just declared war. By evening, Elias' phone was ringing too. Richard, calling from his office, his voice tight with fury. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Elia?" "I'm protecting my children and myself from a man who was planning to destroy us," she replied calmly. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out about your little scheme?" "What scheme?" "I don't know what you're talking about." "I'm talking about the $50 million you've hidden in offshore accounts. I'm talking about your 2-year affair with a woman who makes a living seducing wealthy married men. I'm talking about your plan to claim my children aren't yours." Her voice remained steady, but the words hit him like bullets. "I know everything, Richard." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Richard finally spoke, his voice was different, colder, more calculating. "You have no idea what you've just started." "Actually, I do. I've started the end of your plan to cheat me and our children out of what we deserve. And Richard? I'm going to win." She hung up the phone and sat back in her chair, feeling simultaneously exhausted and energized. The war was officially beginning, but for the first time in months, Elia felt like she was the one holding the weapons. The declaration of war came in the form of a phone call at 6 in the morning, 3 days after Elia had filed for divorce. She was in the kitchen making coffee when her phone rang, and she saw Richard's lawyer's name on the screen. "Mrs. Lopez, this is Bradford Chin from Chin, Morrison & Associates. I represent your husband in this matter." Elia had heard of Bradford Chin. He was one of the most expensive divorce attorneys in the city, known for his ruthless tactics and his ability to protect wealthy men's assets. The fact that Richard had retained him so quickly told her everything she needed to know about how seriously he was taking this fight. "Mr. Chin, you should know that I'm represented by counsel. Any communications need to go through my attorney." "Of course. I'm simply calling to inform you that my client will be seeking full custody of the minor children, as well as a complete investigation into certain financial irregularities he has discovered." The threat was clear. Richard was going to play dirty, just as she had expected. "Financial irregularities? My client has reason to believe that you may have been accessing accounts and moving funds without authorization. He's also prepared to present evidence regarding your fitness as a parent." Elia felt her temper flare, but she kept her voice level. "Mr. Chin, I think you should know that your client is in for a very unpleasant surprise when this case goes to court. I suggest you advise him to reconsider his strategy. Mrs. Lopez, my client is prepared to be very generous in a settlement if you're willing to be reasonable about custody and your financial demands." "And what does your client consider reasonable?" "Supervised visitation with the children, pending the results of paternity testing. A modest settlement that reflects the prenuptial agreement you signed." Elia laughed, surprising herself with how genuine it sounded. "Mr. Chin, there is no prenuptial agreement. And if your client wants to play games with paternity testing, I'm more than happy to accommodate him. In fact, I insist on it." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Bradford Chin was clearly expecting her to be intimidated by the threats about custody and financial investigations. Instead, she sounded almost eager for the fight. "Mrs. Lopez, I think there may be some misunderstanding about your position here. There's no misunderstanding, Mr. Chin. Your client has been systematically hiding marital assets for 2 years while conducting an affair with a woman who has made a career out of targeting wealthy married men. He's been planning to abandon his family while ensuring they receive as little as possible from the divorce. And now he's threatening to question the parentage of children he knows are his." Elia paused to let that sink in. "So no, I won't be accepting any settlement that doesn't give me and my children everything we're entitled to." After she hung up, Elia called Patricia immediately. "They're moving fast. Richard's lawyer just threatened me with custody challenges and financial investigations." "Good," Patricia said, surprising her. "That means they're scared. If they were confident in Richard's position, they'd be playing this more carefully. The fact that they're leading with threats tells me they know they're in trouble." Over the next few weeks, both sides began building their cases. Richard's team of expensive lawyers filed motion after motion, trying to freeze assets, demanding accounting of every financial transaction Elia had made, requesting psychological evaluations for the children. It was a classic intimidation strategy: overwhelm the opponent with paperwork and legal fees until they give up. But Elia wasn't giving up. If anything, Richard's aggressive tactics only strengthened her resolve. Every motion his lawyers filed reminded her of why she was fighting, not just for money, but for her children's future and her own dignity. Patricia assembled their own team of experts. Financial investigators who specialized in tracing hidden assets. Computer forensics specialists who could recover deleted emails and text messages. Even a private security firm that could provide protection if Richard's behavior became threatening. I've never seen someone prepare for a divorce case this thoroughly, Patricia told her as they reviewed their evidence files. You've documented everything. I had to. I knew Richard would try to make me look like the villain in this story. I needed to be prepared to prove who the real villain is. The most damaging evidence came from Richard's own computer. The software Aliyah had installed had captured everything: his communications with Vanessa, his emails with his lawyers discussing strategies to hide assets, even his research into how to challenge paternity in court. But the smoking gun was a recorded phone conversation between Richard and Vanessa that the software had captured when Richard had taken the call on his computer. In it, they discussed their timeline for the divorce, their plans for Richard's financial future, and most damning of all, their strategy for dealing with the children. The sooner we can get this over with, the better, Vanessa had said. I'm tired of pretending to be patient while you figure out how to get rid of your baggage. The kids aren't baggage, Richard had replied, but his tone was defensive rather than angry. They're not your kids, remember? That's the story we're going with. Once you establish that, you won't have to pay child support and we can move on with our lives. But what if the tests show they are mine? Then we go to plan B. You fight for custody, claim she's an unfit mother, and we get them for half the time. Either way, you minimize your financial obligations. Listening to that recording, Aliyah had to stop the playback several times. Hearing her husband and his mistress discuss her children like they were inconvenient obstacles to be overcome was almost unbearable. But it was also exactly the kind of evidence that would destroy Richard's case in court. This recording alone could win us the case, Patricia said when she heard it. It shows premeditation, conspiracy, and a complete disregard for the children's welfare. But Aliyah wanted more than just a legal victory. She wanted Richard to face the full consequences of his betrayal. That meant exposing not just his affair, but the extent of his financial deception. Working with their financial investigators, they traced the money Richard had hidden across multiple jurisdictions. Shell companies in Delaware. Offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Real estate purchased under assumed names. Investment portfolios managed by firms that specialized in helping wealthy individuals hide assets from their spouses. The total amount was staggering: over $75 million that Richard had systematically moved beyond the reach of any divorce settlement. Money that rightfully belonged to their family, money that should have secured their children's futures, money that Richard had stolen to fund his new life with Vanessa. How did he think he was going to get away with this? Patricia wondered as they reviewed the financial evidence. He thought I was stupid, Aliyah replied. He thought I was just the little wife who managed the household and raised the children while he handled all the important business. He never imagined I would be smart enough to figure out what he was doing. That assumption had been Richard's biggest mistake. He had underestimated the woman he had married, forgotten that she was a trained lawyer with the intelligence and determination to match his own. He had treated her like a naive victim who would accept whatever crumbs he chose to throw her way. Instead, he had created an enemy who knew all his secrets and had the evidence to destroy him. The final piece of their case came from an unexpected source, Vanessa herself. In her eagerness to push Richard toward a quick divorce, she had become careless about her communications. The private investigator Janet Rodriguez had managed to obtain copies of Vanessa's emails and text messages, revealing the full extent of her manipulation. You need to stop being emotional about this, Vanessa had written to Richard just weeks before Aliyah filed for divorce. This is business. You get rid of the wife, minimize the financial damage, and we move on to the next phase of our lives. The longer you wait, the more expensive this becomes. In another message, she had been even more explicit. I didn't leave my last 2 relationships to end up with a man who's too weak to handle his divorce properly. If you can't figure out how to get rid of your family obligations, maybe I need to reconsider whether you're worth my time. These messages revealed Vanessa for what she really was, not a woman in love, but a cold-hearted manipulator who saw Richard as nothing more than her next payday. They also showed Richard as a man so desperate to keep his mistress happy that he was willing to destroy his own children's lives. Are you sure you want to include all of this? Patricia asked as they prepared their final court filing. Some of this evidence is going to be very painful for you to hear in open court. Aliyah looked at the photos of her children on her desk, Olivia and Nathan at their last family vacation, before she knew about Richard's betrayal, when she still believed in their happy family. Those children deserved a father who would protect them, not one who would sacrifice them for his own selfish desires. Include everything, she said firmly. I want the judge to see exactly who Richard really is. And I want him to face the consequences of every choice he's made. The stage was set for a courtroom battle that would determine not just the financial future of their family, but the very definition of justice itself. While Alaya was building her case, Vanessa Torres was busy building her own future, a future she was absolutely certain would include Richard's billions and none of his family complications. At 24, she had already perfected the art of seducing wealthy married men, and Richard was simply her most lucrative target yet. From her luxury apartment paid for by Richard, though he didn't know she was already shopping for penthouses in Manhattan, Vanessa coordinated what she considered the final phase of her most ambitious project. She had been patient for 2 years, playing the role of the devoted mistress while Richard wrestled with guilt about his family. But patience had never been her strong suit, and she was ready to cash out. "Darling, we need to talk about timeline," she said to Richard during one of their evening phone calls. He was supposedly working late again, though Alaya's surveillance would have shown him in Vanessa's apartment, lying in her bed while she painted her nails a shade of red that matched the expensive lingerie he had bought her. "Vanessa, I told you these things take time. I can't just abandon my children. You're not abandoning them. You're prioritizing your own happiness for once." Vanessa had perfected this particular manipulation over years of practice. And besides, once the paternity tests prove they're not yours, this whole custody issue becomes irrelevant. Richard was quiet for a moment. Even after 2 years of Vanessa's coaching, he still struggled with the plan to deny his children. But what if the tests show they are mine? Then we'll deal with it. There are ways to minimize child support obligations. My lawyer in New York has handled situations like this before. This was true. Vanessa's relationship consultant, a man named Harrison Webb who specialized in helping women extract maximum value from affairs with wealthy men, had coached her through similar scenarios with her previous targets. Webb operated in a legal gray area, providing advice that was technically legal but morally questionable. The key, Webb had told her during their last consultation, is to make the husband believe that leaving his family is his idea. Make him feel like the victim. Make him think his wife is the obstacle to his happiness, not you. Vanessa had followed this script perfectly with Richard. Every conversation about his family was carefully crafted to make him feel trapped and unappreciated. Every discussion about their future together was designed to make him see his current life as a prison he needed to escape. "Alaya doesn't understand you the way I do," she would say when Richard expressed doubts. "She's holding you back from your full potential. You're a visionary, baby. You need a partner who appreciates that." What Richard didn't know was that Vanessa had said virtually identical words to her previous targets. The California tech executive had been a creative genius, held back by his conventional wife. The New York real estate mogul had been a pioneer, trapped by his small-minded spouse. The script worked because wealthy, successful men wanted to believe they were special, that their desires justified any betrayal. But Vanessa's patience was wearing thin. Richard was taking too long to file for divorce, too long to cut ties with his family. She had already been in this relationship longer than her previous ones, and she was eager to move on to the next phase of her life. That next phase involved more than just Richard's money. Vanessa had bigger plans, plans that involved using Richard's wealth as a stepping stone to an even more lucrative future. She had been researching other potential targets, men who made Richard's billions look like pocket change. But first, she needed to secure her payout from the current relationship. "I've been thinking," she told Richard one evening as they had dinner at an expensive restaurant where she made sure to be seen by the right people. "Maybe we should take a trip together. Somewhere public. Somewhere people will see us." "Vanessa, you know I can't do that yet. If Alaya finds out If Alaya finds out what? That her husband is unhappy? That he's found someone who actually appreciates him." Vanessa leaned across the table, her voice taking on the sultry tone that never failed to affect Richard. "Baby, you can't live your life in fear of what she might think. You deserve to be happy." This was another technique Webb had taught her. Create situations that forced the target to choose between his family and his mistress. Each time the man chose the mistress, it became easier to make the next request, demand the next compromise. Richard chose the mistress. They took the trip to Miami, the one that would eventually show up in Alaya's evidence file. They stayed in the presidential suite of a luxury hotel, attended high-profile charity events, and made sure their relationship was visible to anyone who cared to look. But even as Vanessa played the role of the devoted girlfriend, she was already planning her exit strategy. Because the truth was, she had no intention of staying with Richard any longer than necessary. Once she secured her financial settlement from his divorce, she would move on to her next target. This was something Richard had never understood about their relationship. He thought Vanessa loved him, thought she was impressed by his intelligence and ambition. In reality, she saw him as a stepping stone, wealthy enough to set her up for life, but not wealthy enough to be her final destination. Her real target was someone like tech mogul Cameron Blake, whose net worth made Richard's fortune look modest. Blake was recently divorced, living alone in his Silicon Valley compound, and according to Vanessa's research, susceptible to the attention of beautiful young women who appreciated his genius. But first she needed to close out the Richard chapter of her life. And that meant making sure his divorce from Aliyah went exactly according to plan. "I've been talking to Harrison about your situation," she told Richard during one of their strategy sessions. "He thinks we need to be more aggressive about documenting Aliyah's instability." "What do you mean?" "I mean we need evidence that she's not fit to be a mother. Maybe she's been drinking too much. Maybe she's been neglecting the children. Maybe she's been having her own affair." Richard looked uncomfortable. "But none of that is true." "It doesn't have to be true, baby. It just has to be believable." Vanessa moved closer to him on the couch, running her fingers through his hair. "I know this is hard for you because you're a good person. But sometimes good people have to do difficult things to protect their future." This was the most dangerous part of Vanessa's manipulation, convincing Richard that destroying his wife's reputation was somehow noble, that protecting his relationship with Vanessa justified any lie, any betrayal. "I don't know if I can do that to her," Richard said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Then let me help you," Vanessa replied. "Let me handle the details. You just focus on building our future together." What Richard didn't realize was that Vanessa was already documenting their conversations, building her own insurance policy. If Richard's divorce went badly, if Aliyah somehow managed to expose their relationship in a way that damaged Vanessa's reputation, she wanted evidence that she had been manipulated by Richard rather than being the manipulator herself. It was a delicate balance, pushing Richard toward the most ruthless possible divorce strategy while maintaining her own plausible deniability. But Vanessa had played this game before and she was very good at it. The irony was that while Vanessa was planning Richard's destruction of his family, she had no idea that Aliyah was planning the destruction of them both. Vanessa's confidence in her own abilities had blinded her to the possibility that she might have finally met her match. She was about to learn that the quiet, devoted wife she had dismissed as an obstacle was actually the most dangerous opponent she had ever faced. And unlike Vanessa's previous target's wives, Aliyah wasn't going to go quietly into financial ruin. The morning of the divorce hearing dawned gray and cold, matching the tension that had been building for months. Aliyah stood in front of her bathroom mirror, adjusting the navy blue dress she had chosen carefully for this day. It was professional but not severe, elegant but not flashy. She wanted to look like exactly what she was, a competent, composed woman who deserved justice. Her hands were steady as she applied her makeup, but her heart was racing. Today, everything she had worked for, all the evidence she had gathered, all the planning she had done, would finally be put to the test. Today, Richard would face the consequences of his choices. Downstairs, Olivia and Nathan were eating breakfast with their babysitter, Mrs. Henderson, who had volunteered to take care of them during the hearing. The children knew their parents were getting divorced, there had been no way to hide that from them, but they didn't know the ugly details. Aliyah was determined to keep it that way for as long as possible. "Mommy, are you going to court today?" Olivia asked, looking up from her cereal with the serious expression she wore when she was worried about something. "Yes, sweetheart. But Mrs. Henderson is going to stay with you, and I'll be back this afternoon. Is Daddy going to be there too?" Aliyah's chest tightened. "Yes, he'll be there." Nathan, who was 5 and still optimistic about the world, brightened up. "Maybe you and Daddy can work things out and we can all live together again." The hope in his voice nearly broke her heart. "Oh, baby, I don't think that's going to happen. But you know what? No matter what happens today, Daddy and I both love you and Olivia very much. That will never change." It was a lie, at least partially. Richard's love for his children had proven to be conditional on his own convenience. But Aliyah wasn't ready to destroy their faith in their father completely. That might come later, when they were older and could understand the full scope of his betrayal. An hour later, Aliyah met Patricia Williams outside the courthouse. Her lawyer looked as prepared as Aliyah felt, carrying 2 large briefcases full of evidence and wearing the expression of someone who was confident in her case. "How are you feeling?" Patricia asked as they walked up the courthouse steps together. "Ready," Aliyah replied, and she meant it. She had spent months preparing for this day, and she was eager to finally tell her story in front of a judge who could actually do something about it. Inside the courthouse, They made their way to courtroom B, the same room where Richard would soon make his grand entrance with Vanessa. But Alaya was there first, sitting quietly on the wooden bench, reviewing her notes one final time. She could see Richard's legal team setting up at the defendant's table, Bradford Chin and 3 associates, all wearing expensive suits and confident expressions. They had clearly expected this to be a routine case, a wealthy man divorcing his wife with minimal complications. They had no idea what was about to hit them. At exactly 9:30, the courtroom doors opened with that dramatic bang, and Richard made his entrance. The sight of him walking in with Vanessa on his arm, both of them smiling like they were attending a social event rather than a legal proceeding, filled Alaya with a cold fury that surprised her with its intensity. Richard looked good, success had been kind to him physically, and he was wearing one of his most expensive suits. But there was something different about his face, something harder and more calculating than the man she had married. Vanessa, meanwhile, looked like she was posing for photographers, her red dress and perfect makeup carefully chosen to make a statement. "Unbelievable," Patricia murmured under her breath. "He actually brought her." "Good," Alaya replied quietly. "Let the judge see exactly who he chose over his family." Judge Harrison entered the courtroom a few minutes later, and Alaya could see him taking note of the unusual dynamics, the wife sitting alone with her lawyer, the husband sitting with his legal team and his obvious mistress. His expression suggested he had seen this scenario before, and it never ended well for anyone involved. "We are here today for the divorce proceedings of Lopez versus Lopez," Judge Harrison announced. "Mr. Chin, you may begin with your opening argument." Bradford Chin stood up with the confidence of a man who had never lost a high-stakes divorce case. "Your Honor, my client, Richard Lopez, is here today seeking dissolution of a marriage that has become untenable due to his wife's infidelity and financial irresponsibility. We will present evidence showing that Mrs. Lopez has been unfaithful to her marriage vows and has engaged in questionable financial conduct that has put the family's assets at risk." Alaya watched Richard's face as his lawyer spoke. He was nodding along, playing the role of the wronged husband, but she could see the nervousness in his eyes. Deep down, he had to know that his strategy was built on lies, and lies had a way of crumbling under scrutiny. "Furthermore," Chin continued, "my client has serious doubts about the parentage of the children in question and requests DNA testing to establish paternity before any custody or support arrangements are finalized." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Alaya saw several people in the courtroom gallery, reporters who had gotten wind of the high-profile divorce, lean forward with interest. This was the kind of salacious detail that made headlines. But Alaya wasn't intimidated. If anything, she was pleased that Richard was leading with his weakest argument. The DNA tests would only prove what she had always known, that he was absolutely the father of her children. Patricia Williams stood up for her opening argument, and her tone was completely different from Chen's theatrical presentation. She was calm, professional, and utterly confident. "Your Honor, my client is here today seeking justice after discovering that her husband of 8 years has been systematically betraying their marriage and their family. We will present clear, documented evidence of Mr. Lopez's adultery, his attempts to hide marital assets, and his calculated plan to abandon his parental responsibilities." She gestured toward the evidence tables, where boxes of documents, photographs, and recordings were neatly organized. "The evidence will show that Mr. Lopez has been conducting a 2-year affair with his assistant, Ms. Vanessa Torres, while simultaneously moving over $75 million in marital assets to accounts beyond the reach of any divorce settlement." Richard's face went pale. He clearly hadn't expected Alaya to know about the hidden money, let alone have documentation of it. "Most disturbing of all," Patricia continued, "we will present evidence that Mr. Lopez has been coached by his mistress to deny paternity of his own children he has raised and claimed as his own for 5 years, in a calculated attempt to avoid his parental obligations." Judge Harrison was making notes, his expression growing more serious with each revelation. "These are very serious allegations, Ms. Williams." "Yes, Your Honor, they are. And we have the evidence to support every single one of them." The battle lines were drawn. On one side, Richard and his expensive lawyers, backed by Vanessa's manipulative strategy and years of financial deception. On the other side, Alaya and Patricia, armed with the truth and the evidence to prove it. "Mr. Chin," Judge Harrison said, "please call your first witness." Bradford Chin smiled confidently. "Your Honor, I call Richard Lopez to the stand." This was the moment Alaya had been waiting for, watching her husband take an oath to tell the truth, then proceed to lie under penalty of perjury. Because that's exactly what Richard was about to do, and she had the evidence to prove every false word that came out of his mouth. Richard walked to the witness stand with the same confidence he had shown entering the courtroom. But Elijah could see the slight tremor in his hands as he placed them on the Bible. Somewhere deep inside, he had to know that his carefully constructed lies were about to be exposed. The truth was coming, and it was going to destroy everything Richard had built on deception. Richard Lopez took the witness stand like a man who owned the courtroom. His expensive suit was perfectly tailored, his posture confident, his expression that of a successful businessman who was used to commanding respect. But Elijah could see the small signs of nervousness, the way he adjusted his tie twice, the slight tremor in his voice as he was sworn in. "Mr. Lopez," Bradford Chin began, "please tell the court about the state of your marriage to the plaintiff." Richard cleared his throat and looked directly at the judge, avoiding Elijah's gaze entirely. "Your Honor, my marriage to Elijah has been deteriorating for several years. I've tried to make it work, but there have been issues with trust, with fidelity, with her ability to manage our family responsibilities." The lies came so smoothly that Elijah almost admired his performance. This was the Richard who had built a billion-dollar company, the man who could convince investors to hand over millions based on nothing but his vision and charisma. "Can you elaborate on these trust issues?" Chin prompted. "I discovered that my wife has been accessing business accounts without authorization. I also have reason to believe she has been unfaithful to our marriage." Richard's voice took on a tone of wounded dignity. "Most disturbingly, I have serious doubts about whether the children she claims are mine are actually biologically related to me." In the gallery, Vanessa nodded supportively, playing her role as the devoted girlfriend who was simply supporting her man through a difficult time. But Elijah caught the slight smile that crossed her lips when Richard denied paternity of the children. This was what Vanessa had coached him to say, the lie that was supposed to free him from child support obligations. "Your Honor," Chin continued, "my client is requesting DNA testing to establish paternity before any custody arrangements are made. He has been supporting these children for 5 years based on his wife's assurances, but recent discoveries have made him question everything about their relationship." Judge Harrison looked skeptical. "Mr. Lopez, you're claiming that children you've raised since birth might not be yours?" "I'm afraid so, Your Honor. It's a painful realization, but I can't continue to base my life on lies." The performance was flawless, but Elijah knew it was just that, a performance. Richard was playing the role of the betrayed husband with the same skill he used to pitch investors or negotiate business deals. Unfortunately for him, Elijah had evidence that would expose every word as perjury. Chin spent another 20 minutes walking Richard through his version of events, how he had discovered Elijah's supposed infidelity, how he had reluctantly begun to question the children's parentage, how he had tried to save their marriage despite her betrayals. It was a masterful construction of lies, each one designed to paint Elijah as the villain and Richard as the victim. Finally, Chin sat down with a satisfied expression. "No further questions, Your Honor." "Ms. Williams," Judge Harrison said, "your witness." Patricia Williams stood up slowly, deliberately. She walked to the witness stand carrying a single manila folder, her expression calm but predatory. Elijah had seen this look before. It was the expression of a lawyer who was about to destroy someone with their own words. "Mr. Lopez," Patricia began, her voice conversational, "you testified that you have concerns about the paternity of your children. Is that correct?" "Yes, that's correct." "And these concerns developed recently?" "Over the past several months, yes." Patricia opened her folder and pulled out a document. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit into evidence the DNA test results for Olivia and Nathan Lopez, conducted 3 weeks ago at the request of the plaintiff." Richard's face went white. Bradford Chin shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. We weren't notified of any DNA testing. The plaintiff has every right to establish paternity of her own children," Judge Harrison replied. "Overruled. Ms. Williams, please proceed." Patricia handed the document to the court clerk, then turned back to Richard. "Mr. Lopez, according to these certified DNA test results, there is a 99.97% probability that you are the biological father of both children. Were you aware of these results?" Richard's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He couldn't deny the science, but admitting he knew the children were his would expose his entire strategy as a deliberate lie. I hadn't seen those specific results," he stammered. "But you had no actual reason to doubt your paternity, did you? No evidence of infidelity on your wife's part, no medical concerns, nothing except your desire to avoid child support payments." "That's not true. Mr. Lopez, let's talk about infidelity." Patricia's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. You testified that you believe your wife has been unfaithful. Do you have evidence of this? I have my suspicions. Suspicions aren't evidence, Mr. Lopez. Do you have photographs, witnesses, documentation of any kind showing that your wife has been unfaithful? Richard was starting to sweat now. Not exactly, but No, you don't. Because your wife hasn't been unfaithful, has she? But you have. Bradford Chin jumped up again. Objection, Your Honor. This line of questioning goes directly to the credibility of the witness, Patricia interrupted smoothly. Your Honor, the defendant has made serious accusations against my client. I have the right to explore whether those accusations are projection of his own behavior. Overruled. Answer the question, Mr. Lopez. Richard looked desperately at his lawyer, then at Vanessa in the gallery. Neither could help him now. I don't know what you're implying. I'm not implying anything, Mr. Lopez. I'm stating a fact. You have been having an affair with your assistant, Vanessa Torres, for 2 years. Isn't that correct? The courtroom was dead silent. Richard's mouth moved but no sound came out. Finally, he managed to whisper, I refuse to answer on the grounds that it might incriminate me. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Harrison banged his gavel. Mr. Lopez, this is a civil proceeding, not a criminal one. You don't have Fifth Amendment protections here. Answer the question. Yes, Richard said, so quietly that the court reporter had to ask him to repeat himself. Yes, I've been involved with Miss Torres. Patricia nodded as if this was exactly what she had expected. For how long? About 2 years. And during this 2-year affair, you continued to live with your wife, sleep in the same bed, present yourself as a faithful husband? Yes. And you never told your wife about this relationship? No. So when you testified earlier about trust issues in your marriage, you were actually describing your own betrayal of your wife's trust, weren't you? Richard couldn't answer. The trap Patricia had set was perfect. Every word he had spoken in his own defense had now been turned against him. But Patricia wasn't done. She pulled out another document from her folder. Mr. Lopez, let's talk about financial responsibility. You testified that your wife has been accessing business accounts without authorization. But isn't it true that you've been systematically hiding marital assets from her? I don't know what you mean. Your Honor, I'd like to submit into evidence financial records showing that the defendant has moved over $75 million in marital assets to offshore accounts and shell companies over the past 2 years. The number hit the courtroom like a physical blow. $75 million. Even the reporters in the gallery were frantically taking notes now. Bradford Chin was on his feet again, but Judge Harrison waved him down before he could object. Ms. Williams, that's a very serious allegation. Yes, Your Honor, it is. Mr. Lopez, are you familiar with Cayman Islands account number 847291653? Richard's face had gone from white to gray. I may have some investments. This isn't an investment, Mr. Lopez. This is a personal account containing $12 million in funds transferred from your joint accounts with your wife. Are you claiming you forgot about $12 million? I was protecting our assets. From whom? From your wife. The mother of your children? Patricia's voice was getting sharper now, the kill shot approaching. Or were you hiding this money so you could start a new life with Miss Torres while leaving your family with as little as possible? The courtroom was electric with tension. Everyone could see that Richard was being systematically destroyed, but Patricia wasn't finished. She pulled out her final piece of evidence, a tablet computer. Your Honor, I'd like to play a recorded conversation between the defendant and Miss Torres, captured 3 weeks ago. Bradford Chin shot to his feet. Your Honor, if this recording was made without consent. It was captured by monitoring software installed on Mr. Lopez's personal computer, which is jointly owned marital property, Patricia replied smoothly. Perfectly legal. Judge Harrison nodded. Play the recording. The sound of Richard's voice filled the courtroom, clear and unmistakable. The sooner we can get this over with, the better. Then Vanessa's voice, sharp and calculating. I'm tired of pretending to be patient while you figure out how to get rid of your baggage. The kids aren't baggage, Richard's recorded voice replied weakly. They're not your kids, remember? That's the story we're going with. Once you establish that, you won't have to pay child support and we can move on with our lives. The courtroom erupted. Reporters were frantically typing, spectators were gasping, and Richard looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Even Bradford Chin looked stunned. His client had just been caught on tape conspiring to commit perjury. But the recording wasn't over. Vanessa's voice continued. If the tests show they are yours, then we go to Plan B. You fight for custody, claim she's an unfit mother, and we get them for half the time. Either way, you minimize your financial obligations. Judge Harrison banged his gavel repeatedly to restore order. When the courtroom finally quieted, he looked directly at Richard with an expression of barely controlled anger. Mr. Lopez, did I just hear you and Ms. Torres discussing a plan to deny paternity of your children as a financial strategy? Richard couldn't speak. He just sat there, destroyed by his own words. Patricia Williams walked back to her table with the satisfied expression of someone who had just delivered a knockout blow. No further questions, Your Honor. As Richard stumbled off the witness stand, Aliyah felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. This was the man she had loved, the father of her children, and she had just watched him completely destroyed by the truth of his own actions. But he had chosen this path. Every lie, every betrayal, every calculated move to destroy his family, those had been his choices. Now he was facing the consequences. In the gallery, Vanessa looked like she was ready to run. The woman who had thought she was manipulating Richard into leaving his wife had just been exposed as the architect of a conspiracy to defraud a family. Her carefully laid plans were crumbling as spectacularly as Richard's lies. Judge Harrison looked at both legal teams with the expression of a man who had heard enough. I think we need a recess before we continue. 1 hour. As the courtroom cleared, Aliyah remained seated, watching Richard huddle with his lawyers and Vanessa. They looked like people trying to figure out how to survive a disaster of their own making. The truth had exploded exactly as Aliyah had planned. Now came the final phase, making sure justice was served. After the recess, Judge Harrison returned to the courtroom with the expression of a man who had made his decision. The hour break had given everyone time to process what they had heard, and the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Richard sat at the defendant's table looking like a man who had aged 10 years in one morning, while Vanessa had disappeared entirely, fleeing the courthouse the moment she realized her carefully constructed plan had collapsed. Before we continue with testimony, Judge Harrison began, I want to address what I've heard this morning. Mr. Lopez, in 23 years on this bench, I have rarely encountered such a systematic attempt to defraud not just the court, but your own family. Richard's lawyer started to stand, but the judge held up his hand. Mr. Chin, your client has admitted under oath to adultery, perjury, and conspiracy to hide marital assets. I suggest you advise him that his best option at this point is complete honesty about his financial holdings. The message was clear, Judge Harrison had heard enough lies. Any hope Richard had of salvaging something from this disaster depended on his cooperation now. Your Honor, Bradford Chin said carefully, my client is prepared to provide full financial disclosure if it would help facilitate a fair settlement. It's a little late for fair settlements, Mr. Chin. Your client had 2 years to be fair. Instead, he chose deception. Judge Harrison turned to Patricia Williams. Ms. Williams, please present your client's requests for relief. Patricia stood, and Aliyah could see the controlled satisfaction in her posture. This was the moment they had been building toward for months. Your Honor, given the defendant's systematic betrayal of his marriage vows, his conspiracy to hide marital assets, and his attempted fraud regarding the paternity of his children, my client requests the following: full custody of the minor children with supervised visitation for the defendant pending counseling. Division of all marital assets, including the $75 million the defendant attempted to hide. Alimony in the amount of $2 million annually for 10 years. And payment of all legal fees associated with uncovering the defendant's deception. The numbers were staggering, but they were also justified. Richard had tried to steal from his own family, and now he was going to pay the price for that betrayal. Bradford Chin looked like he was going to object, but Judge Harrison's expression made it clear that objections would not be welcome. Instead, he whispered frantically with Richard, who looked increasingly desperate as the reality of his situation sank in. Your Honor, Chin finally said, my client would like to request a brief recess to consider his options. Mr. Chin, your client's options are very simple. He can agree to these terms, or I can make my own decision about asset division. And I assure you, my decision will be far less generous to your client than Ms. Williams's proposal. Richard leaned over to whisper something to his lawyer, his face pale and defeated. After a moment, Chin stood again. Your Honor, my client accepts the plaintiff's terms. The words seemed to echo in the courtroom. After months of lies, manipulation, and legal maneuvering, the case was over. Richard had surrendered completely. But Judge Harrison wasn't finished. Mr. Lopez, I want you to understand something. Your children will grow up knowing that their father valued money and his mistress more than their welfare. Your business associates will know that you're willing to lie under oath when it serves your interests. And this court will be referring your case to the district attorney for possible criminal charges related to perjury and financial fraud. Richard's head dropped into his hands. In trying to destroy his wife, he had destroyed himself instead. Furthermore, the judge continued, I'm ordering that all assets hidden by the defendant be returned to joint marital property immediately. Any attempt to further hide or transfer assets will result in contempt charges and possible jail time. As the gavel came down, Aliyah felt a mixture of emotions she hadn't expected. Relief, certainly, the fight was over and she had won. Satisfaction that Richard was facing consequences for his actions. But also sadness for the family that could have been, for the man she had once loved who had chosen to become someone she couldn't recognize. Outside the courthouse, Patricia Williams reviewed the terms of the settlement with Aliyah. You understand what this means? You'll receive approximately half of Richard's total assets, including the money he tried to hide. With the alimony, you and the children will be financially secure for life. Aliyah nodded, but money wasn't what mattered most to her now. What about custody? Full physical custody, with Richard having supervised visits until he completes court-mandated counseling. Given what we heard in there, I doubt he'll fight for more than that. And Vanessa? Patricia smiled grimly. Miss Torres is likely facing her own legal problems. The DA's office is very interested in her role in this conspiracy. Her days of seducing wealthy married men are probably over. As they walked down the courthouse steps, Aliyah saw Richard, emerging from a side door flanked by his lawyers. He looked broken, defeated, nothing like the confident man who had strutted into court that morning with his mistress on his arm. For a moment, their eyes met across the courthouse plaza. There was so much Aliyah could have said to him. She could have gloated about her victory, reminded him of everything he had lost through his own choices. Instead, she simply looked at him with something like pity. He had traded everything that mattered for a relationship with a woman who had abandoned him the moment things got difficult. That evening, Aliyah sat in her living room with Olivia and Nathan, reading them a bedtime story. The house felt different now, not just because Richard was gone but because the uncertainty was finally over. The children would grow up in a home where honesty mattered, where family came first, where love wasn't conditional on convenience. Mommy, Olivia said as Aliyah tucked her into bed, are you sad about the divorce? Aliyah considered the question carefully. I'm sad that our family is different now. But I'm not sad that we're going to be okay. Are we going to be okay? Yes, sweetheart. We're going to be more than okay. We're going to be happy. And for the first time in years, Aliyah believed that was true. 6 months later, Aliyah received a letter from Richard's lawyers informing her that he had entered a plea agreement on the criminal charges, accepting probation and community service in exchange for full cooperation in returning hidden assets. Vanessa, the letter mentioned, had been indicted on charges of conspiracy and fraud. Her pattern of targeting wealthy married men had finally caught up with her. Aliyah filed the letter away without much interest. Richard and Vanessa belonged to her past now. Her future was about raising her children, rebuilding her law career, and creating a life based on truth instead of lies. The money from the settlement had allowed her to start her own law practice, specializing in helping women navigate difficult divorces. She had learned firsthand how devastating it could be when someone you trusted betrayed that trust, and she was determined to help other women protect themselves and their children. On the first anniversary of the divorce, Aliyah took Olivia and Nathan to the park where she and Richard had walked when they were dating. The children ran ahead to the playground while she sat on a bench, thinking about how much had changed. A year ago, she had been a woman desperately trying to hold together a marriage to a man who was systematically betraying her. Today she was a successful lawyer, a devoted mother, and a woman who had learned that she was stronger than she had ever imagined. Her phone buzzed with a text message. For a moment, her heart jumped, thinking it might be Richard trying to contact her. Instead, it was from Mrs. Henderson, the babysitter who had become like family. How did the court hearing go for your new client? Aliyah smiled as she typed back, we won. Another woman gets to start over with everything she deserves. That was her life now, helping other women find their strength, protecting families from the people who were supposed to protect them, making sure that justice wasn't just a word but a reality. As she watched her children play, laughing and carefree, Aliyah realized that Richard's betrayal had given her something unexpected. The knowledge that she could survive anything, overcome any obstacle, and build a better life from the ashes of a broken one. The woman who had walked into that courtroom a year ago, terrified and unsure, was gone. In her place was someone stronger, someone who had learned that the best revenge wasn't anger or hatred. It was living well, protecting what mattered, and never again allowing someone else's choices to define her worth. Richard had walked into court thinking he held all the cards. Instead, he had learned that the woman he had underestimated was the one who truly understood how to play the game. And she had won everything that mattered.